The Jacobite army of Charles Edward Stuart won every battle during the 45 Rising up until the disastrous Battle of Culloden. This begs the question, why were the rebels so effective to begin with? Well, in this video we will be exploring the main components of the Prince's army in 1745 and 1746, including its infantry, cavalry and artillery. This will allow us to see why the Jacobites were a force to be reckoned with, but should also reveal the fatal weaknesses of their army. For many, the word Jacobite conjures up the image of a kilted Highlander racing across a moor wielding a broadsword. However, as you'll find out in this video, the Jacobite army boasted a diverse array of troops, in which Catholic, Gaelic-speaking Highland clansmen were actually a minority. We can divide the Jacobite infantry into three separate types: the Highland clan regiments, lowland militias, and regulars in the service of the French crown. In the Scottish Highlands, day-to-day life was shaped by constant clan warfare, fueled by blood feuds over land and cattle. Therefore, all able-bodied men in the clan were expected to serve their chief as levies in times of war. As a result, Highland clansmen were tough warriors, accustomed to hardship and epic feats of endurance, such as travelling over large distances to raid enemy territory. In the 17th century, Highlanders fighting as mercenaries in mainland Europe were noted for their hardiness and unique ability to endure cold weather dressed in their plaids. However, it is important to see beyond the romanticism of the clan warriors. Feuds were often filled with brutal atrocities, and any cotter or tenant who refused to fight for their chief or tacksman would face serious repercussions. When Prince Charles Edward Stuart arrived in Scotland in July 1745, he expected full support from the Highlanders and sought to raise a mighty clan army. Many clans, such as the MacDonalds and Camerons, flocked to the prince's standard, which was raised at Glenfinnan, but a considerable number did not. By 1745, there were only a tiny number of Catholics in Scotland, being concentrated in the Western Highlands and Islands. Many Presbyterian Highlanders, which included the Grants and Campbells, were staunch supporters of the Kirk and the British government. Clan Cameron and its chief, Donald Cameron of Lochiel, provided hundreds of men for the Jacobite cause. Those which refused to go were threatened with being flogged or even evicted. The Highland clan regiments would have provided most of their own weapons. Despite a disarming act in 1715, without a full military occupation of every glen in the Highlands, the government found it impossible to enforce. The clan elites were armed with basket-hilted broadswords, targes and pistols, with the lowly commoners armed with Lochaber axes and farm tools. The Lochaber axe proved highly effective against British cavalry at Falkirk Moor in January 1746, with a hook to pull riders out of the saddle and a savage blade for scything at horses' legs. The Highlanders were also well armed with muskets, some of them supplied by the French and others captured following early Jacobite victories. The preferred tactic of the clan regiments, which was used to great effect at Preston Pans in September 1745, was the feared Highland charge. With the best equipped tacksmen at the front, the Highlanders would clump together and race towards their enemies, protecting themselves from musket fire using their targes. The Highlanders would often fire a single volley with their muskets before rushing forward. For the charge to be successful, the ground had to be suitable. Momentum was crucial, and boggy ground would fatally stall the charge. A disadvantage of these clan regiments was that they were unreliable, with clansmen often heading back to their clachans to stash away plunder. This was the cause of a delay before the invasion of England, which gave the Duke of Cumberland enough time to return from Flanders with his army before the Jacobites reached London. Many Episcopalian lowlanders from southern Scotland were staunch Jacobites, as the Church of Episcopal had been dismantled during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This was the revolution which saw the Stuarts overthrown by the Prince and Princess of Orange, William and Mary. About 20% of Jacobite recruits came from Perthshire due to the prevalence of Episcopalianism in the region. At Culloden in April 1746, musket-armed lowland infantry made up part of the second line of the Jacobite army behind the clan regiments. One of these lowland regiments was led by the Duke of Perth. These lowland infantry were usually armed with muskets and bayonets, being given basic training. The Lowlanders would have worn breeches and hose, unlike the mainly kilted Highlanders. However, the Lowlanders were required to wear a tartan sash and the white cockade of Stuart on their bonnets. These soldiers lacked the ferocity or martial culture of the Highland clansmen, while also lacking the discipline or experience of the British redcoats. Although the majority of the Jacobite army was comprised of militia, whether Highland or Lowland, there was a small contingent of professional soldiers. These troops were fighting in the service of the French crown, which had been keen to support the Jacobites in order to threaten the British government. At Culloden, there were 350 men of the Royal Écossais, along with a contingent of Irish pickets under Brigadier Stapleton. The total number of regular soldiers in the Jacobite army at Culloden was only about 600 out of 5,000 to 6,000 men fighting for the prince. The Irish and Scots in these French units were mostly exiles, with Irish Catholics being oppressed by the Hanoverians. In spite of being small in number, these soldiers bravely covered the Jacobite retreat at Culloden. Stapleton, leader of the Irish pickets, was killed by government dragoons. As professionals in French service, the pickets and Royal Écossais received quarter, while any other captured Jacobites could expect none, as rebels in arms. Ultimately, although they were skilled and resolute soldiers, these professional Scottish and Irish troops were too few in number to turn the tide. The Jacobite army during the 45 Rising included a very small number of light cavalry, whose main role was scouting. Most of the cavalrymen, especially the officers, were drawn from the gentry of cities like Dundee and Edinburgh. Bagot's Scotch Hussars, numbering only 50 men, had a very distinctive look, with fur-trimmed caps and tartan coats. The only example I've found of Jacobite cavalry being engaged in battle was at Culloden, where Strathallan's horse unsuccessfully attempted to hold back the advance of government troops. The Jacobite artillery consisted of several guns captured at the Battle of Preston Pans and a few supplied by the French. A handful of these artillery pieces were left behind in Carlisle during the Jacobite retreat from England. Hilariously, at the Siege of Stirling, some thought the engineer in command of the Jacobite guns had been bribed by the enemy because his artillery's positioning and performance was so shockingly bad. At Culloden, the undermanned Jacobite artillery was beaten in an artillery duel by the British gunners. Overall, the Jacobite army had more flaws than it had strengths. The unreliability of the Highlanders and the Lowland infantry's lack of discipline or training when compared to the Redcoats, combined with a lack of many professional soldiers, decisively undermined the Jacobite cause. Early Jacobite victories were down to the shock of the Highland charge and most of the British troops being away in the continent. Ultimately, when faced with superior numbers of well-trained government troops on unfavourable terrain, the Jacobite army, suffering from desertion and poor morale, was crushed in just 40 minutes.